Hey guys, tonight we're diving deep into the grim, dangerous, and decidedly unglamorous world of medieval assassins. You know, those shadowy figures Hollywood makes look like total rock stars, creeping through castle halls and dark alleys, changing history with a blade and a whisper. Well, spoiler alert, being a medieval assassin seriously sucked. Like, seriously sucked. So, before you get too comfortable and start practicing your brooding stares, do me a huge favor. Hit that like button right now and subscribe to the channel. Only if you genuinely enjoy what I'm doing here, of course. No pressure. And while you're at it, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe put on a fan for that soft background and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let's get one thing straight. No one in medieval times woke up and cheerfully declared, "You know what? I'd love to stab a nobleman in the throat for 12 silver coins and the honor of hiding in a barrel for 3 days." Becoming an assassin wasn't a career path. It was more like the very last stop on my life went horribly, terribly wrong train. Most medieval assassins weren't mysterious loners trained in mountaintop temples. Oh no, they were desperate peasants, disgraced soldiers, ex-thieves with surprisingly decent aim, or just people so far off society's radar they could murder someone and still wouldn't be counted in the census. If you were well off, you didn't become an assassin. You hired one. If you had a title, land, or even a particularly plump goat to your name, you were basically in management. But if you just escaped debtor's prison, had a knack for solving problems, and could sneak into a tavern unnoticed, congratulations. Someone, somewhere, was about to slide a coin purse across a table and whisper a name. And that name wasn't a fun one. You weren't asked to take out Bob, the quiet turnip farmer. It was usually a corrupt baron, a bishop with too much gold, or someone with 12 bodyguards and a moat full of very grumpy crocodiles. The pay? Tempting. The job? Horrifying. But by the time someone considered it, they had absolutely nothing left to lose. No family, no future, and definitely no dental plan. Plus, let's not forget the absolute lack of job perks. No pension, no glory, no evenings off. You couldn't exactly hang up a shingle that said, "Quiet eliminations by appointment." You just had to stay quiet, move fast, and never, ever tell anyone what you did for a living, especially not loudly over ale at the inn. Oh, yeah, I'm a traveling carpet seller. The stains? Just die. So yes, nobody dreamed of being a medieval assassin. They landed there because the world chewed them up and spit them out. Wearing a hood and holding a rusty dagger. You weren't the hero. You weren't even the villain. You were the footnote that made everyone nervous and probably didn't live long enough to enjoy the coin. Let's bust the first myth wide open. Medieval assassins didn't train under candlelight in some hidden monastery with wise mentors and inspirational flute music. There was no montage, no sensei, no "you got this" pep talk. If you learned anything, it was by not dying the first few times you tried. Most assassins weren't trained professionals. They were desperate amateurs with a decent sense of direction and the uncanny ability to climb quietly without sneezing. If you had military experience, great. That meant you knew how to hold a knife properly. If not, well, stabbing someone is fairly intuitive, but escaping afterward with both kidneys still intact? That takes skill, or more often just pure luck. There were no manuals, no guild orientation meetings, no safety briefings. You didn't get taught how to spot a body double or where nobles kept their secret bedroom exits. You figured it out while hanging from a windowsill, wondering if you just crept into the servants' quarters again. Poisons? Oh, that was trial and error, with a heavy emphasis on error. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes your target just got mildly dizzy and became even more suspicious of his soup. And sometimes you drank the wrong cup yourself. There was no medieval poison control hotline, just hope, herbal guesswork, and a strong stomach. Sure, if you were lottery lucky, you might have picked up some skills from thieves or mercenaries. Maybe an older assassin showed you how to walk without squeaking on cobblestones. But mentoring wasn't standard. It was rare and short-lived, because assassins don't retire. They disappear. Weapons training? Forget it. You weren't carrying a broadsword. You had a dagger you stole off a guard, maybe a garrote if you're feeling fancy, and whatever else fit under your cloak without jingling. So no, you weren't some shadowy martial arts master. You were a guy with callous hands, quiet footsteps, and a deeply unhealthy relationship with alleyways. Success didn't come from training. It came from survival. You learned how to kill by doing it quickly, sloppily, then vanishing before anyone could sketch your face and tack it to a church door. In short, your education was brutal, practical, and offered zero graduation ceremonies. Just bruises, bloodstains, and the creeping realization that you were very much on your own. Let's talk about why you became an assassin in the first place. Coin. Cold, heavy jingling, deliciously spendable coin. The promise of it is what got you into this. But the reality? You got paid in lies. When someone hires an assassin, they don't want a long-term relationship. They want a one-time service, no paperwork, and ideally, no witnesses, including you. They offer you a pouch of silver, half now, half when the job is done. That's if they're feeling generous. But here's the kicker. When the job is done is code for after we verify you didn't mess it up or make us look bad, or leave a trail that leads back to us, or survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So you do the job. You sneak through shadows, risk your life, maybe kill a baron in his sleep. Not pretty, not poetic. And when you return, yes, about that payment the client fled, terribly sorry. Or worse, they try to kill you. A knife to the gut is cheaper than a bonus. And even when you do get paid, it's never quite enough. Not for the risk, not for the blood, not for the 3 days you spent hiding in a haystack with fleas and more regret. You get a handful of coins, a curt nod, and a reminder. You were never here. Oh, and fun fact, some contracts were fake. Political traps. You'd be told to assassinate someone dangerous, only to find out it was a decoy with guards waiting. Congratulations. You just walked into a sting operation with your name already carved on the gallows. And even when the deal was real, you couldn't exactly go to court and file a complaint. Your Honor, I'd like to sue Lord Edmund for breach of assassin contract. The only court you'd see was the one where you were the exhibit. So, you learned to take what you could, demand payment up front, and trust absolutely no one. Not even the greasy little scribe who swore this job would change your life. It did, mostly by shortening it. Being an assassin meant living on broken promises and vanishing before they broke you. So, you've taken the job. You've been lied to about the pay. You're probably going to die. Now let's talk gear. Forget the fantasy novels and sneaky video games. There were no retractable wrist blades, smoke bombs, enchanted daggers, or crossbows that folded neatly into your boot. Your toolkit consisted of whatever you could steal, sharpen, or hide beneath a tattered cloak without clanking. If you were lucky, and I mean found a gold coin in a dead man's shoe lucky, you had a good dagger. Not ornate, not curved like a dragon's tooth. Just sharp, hopefully rust-free, and ideally one that didn't smell like the last guy you stabbed with it. Poison? It existed, sure, but it wasn't as glamorous as a slow drip into a wine goblet. Most medieval poisons were unpredictable, made from plants, minerals, or toad guts. Some worked instantly, some took hours. Some just made your victim vomit for 2 days and then recover, angrier and now very suspicious of stew. Ropes? Occasionally useful. You could strangle, climb, or tie something up with one, but you'd better know how to use it fast, because nothing kills a mood like trying to wrestle someone while muttering, "Wait!" which not goes under again. Bows? Effective. Yes, if you had one, knew how to shoot it, and weren't trying to smuggle it through a palace disguised as a flower arranger. Most assassinations were up close and personal. No time for elegant marksmanship, just quick, quiet, and hopefully not messy enough to slip in. And you didn't get backups. If your blade bent, broke, or fell down a well, time to improvise. Slate roof tile, maybe? Rusty nail? Worth a shot. Shoe buckle with intent? Desperate times. You carried your tools hidden in hems, boots, or inside hollowed-out bread if needed. And you kept them close, not for safety, but because in this line of work, your weapon was your best friend, your boss, and your only retirement plan. There were no upgrades, no tinkering with gear between missions. You didn't polish your kit. You prayed it didn't betray you mid-strike, because in the end, it wasn't a weapon that did the killing. It was you, alone, poorly equipped, and expected to perform miracles with a spoon and a prayer. Assassins weren't hired to take out random drunks in back alleys. No one paid you to stab Jeff, the sleepy candle maker. Your targets were important. Nobles, bishops, military officers, sometimes even royalty. And those people, they were very, very hard to kill. First, there were the guards. Not one or two, but dozens, armed, armored, and well-fed. Some guarded the front, some the back, some just stood there looking intimidating, daring you to blink wrong. You'd spend days memorizing patrol patterns, door creaks, and exactly how many stairs it took before the guard with asthma needed a breather. Second, there were walls. Castles in their front porches. They had gatehouses, murder holes, and moats full of things that bite. If you didn't fall into the water, you still had to worry about arrow slits and boiling oil. Yes, boiling oil. Your job description included, may get flambéed for peeking. Third, there were the servants and staff, the cooks, scribes, and stable boys. One wrong look from you, and they'd be whispering to the guard captain faster than you could say, I'm just the herbalist. Assassins weren't just fighting swords. They were fighting gossip. And medieval gossip travels at light speed if it means someone gets to keep their head. And finally, your actual target, paranoid. Rightfully so. These people were surrounded by backstabbers, relatives with dubious claims to their titles, and 36 people pretending to like them. They didn't eat without a tester. They didn't sleep without 3 locks on the door. Some even slept in decoy beds or rotated rooms, like a deadly version of musical chairs. And don't get excited if you hear they're attending a feast. Yes, they'll be drunk, but so will you, and you'll still have to get past the royal guards. 3 dogs, a very alert jester, and 50 witnesses holding tankards. Even getting close to your target could take weeks. Posing as a servant, bribing a chambermaid, hiding in barrels. And when the moment finally came, you had one shot. One precise, perfect, non-squeaky, non-bloody, ghost vanish in the night moment. Or you become the next public deterrent, swinging from the castle gate with a sign that read, "Nice try." Let's be honest. When you picture a medieval assassin, you probably imagine sleek black robes, leather bracers, maybe a mysterious billowing in the moonlight. Reality? You look like a sick goat herder with something to hide. Disguises in the Middle Ages weren't exactly high fashion. You didn't have custom-tailored cloaks or retractable armor. You had whatever you could scavenge. Peasant rags, a monk's robe 2 sizes too big, or the remains of a guard uniform that definitely still smelled like its previous owner. The goal was to blend in. But blending it meant looking like everyone else who hadn't bathed in 2 weeks, limp from old injuries, and had a nervous twitch from malnutrition. You didn't look suspicious because of your cloak. You looked suspicious because you kept adjusting your belt to hide a dagger wrapped in cheesecloth. And forget masks. There were no Guy Fawkes options. Most face coverings just made you look like a leper, which was great for avoiding conversation, but terrible for entering parties. If anyone asked who you were, you had to think fast. I'm Brother Tobias. I take care of silent prayer and rooftop maintenance. Even assuming you made it past the guards, noble households weren't full of idiots. Servants noticed unfamiliar faces, especially ones that fumbled chamber pots and couldn't name the cook's cat. You were always one, I've never seen you before, away from being clubbed with a candlestick. And if you're disguised at work, congratulations. You now had to stay in character for hours while pretending not to notice all the very stab-worthy people wandering by. Also wigs, they didn't exist. If you needed to look older or younger, you were stuck smearing dirt on your face, squinting, and hoping no one got close enough to notice that your beard was glued on with honey. The truth was, your disguise didn't protect you. It gave you maybe 5 minutes of confusion. After that, you had to be gone, invisible or very, very convincing. And if anyone saw through it, well, let's just say no one wants to be the assassin caught in the bishop's laundry room, wearing a nun's habit and holding a sword, especially not on a feast day. In medieval times, if you were an assassin, you didn't have a team. You didn't have a psychic with a crossbow, a clever alchemist in a secret lair, or a handler who gave you coded scrolls and warm encouragement. You had a rusty dagger and crippling trust issues. There were no guilds, at least not ones you could actually count on. And if there were whispers of a brotherhood of assassins, it was mostly tavern talk fueled by mead and boredom. You were more likely to meet a ghost than another professional killer who wanted to network. Why the isolation? Because in your business, the fewer people who knew you existed, the longer you lived. Every contact was a risk. Every loose tongue a potential noose. Even your client might not know your real name. And if they did, you were already planning your exit. Companionship? Laughable. Friends ask questions. Lovers notice bruises, bloodstains, and why you always slept with a blade under pillow. You couldn't settle down. You couldn't afford to. One mistake, one person recognizing you in a market, and your whole life turned into a sprint for the nearest sewer grate. Even fellow criminals kept their distance. Thieves and smugglers were sociable. You were that guy who makes people disappear. They feared you, or worse, saw you as a walking liability. No one wanted to share stew with someone whose occupation could attract a mob with torches. And don't expect sympathy. You couldn't tell anyone how hard it was to sleep after silently strangling a corrupt bishop. If you talked about your job, people assumed you were either lying or dangerous. And they weren't wrong. So you kept your secrets, your scars, and your weapons to yourself. At inns, you sat in the darkest corner, back to the wall, eyes always scanning the door. You never drank too much. You never stayed more than a night. You didn't say your name unless someone paid you first. And even then, it probably wasn't your real one. Being a medieval assassin meant perfecting the art of vanishing, not just in a crowd, but from every life you never got to have. Let's say you took the job. You planned your route. You bribed the right doorman. You disguised yourself as a very convincing chimney sweep. And then you froze. Maybe the target turned around unexpectedly. Maybe they were with their child. Maybe you got the shakes at the worst possible moment, and your knife hand trembled like a terrified squirrel. Guess what? You're now dead. Because failure for a medieval assassin wasn't a slap on the wrist or a bad performance review. It was a public, painful, and wildly theatrical death, often involving ropes, fire, wheels, or sharp iron devices with names like the Bone Cracker's Delight. Missing the kill meant blowing the whole operation. Your target lived and immediately told everyone that someone tried to murder them. Suddenly, you weren't a shadow. You were a wanted man with a detailed description and probably a crude sketch tacked to every tavern wall within 30 miles. And those guards you once snuck past, now they're motivated. Sometimes it wasn't even your target you had to worry about. It was your client. If you failed, you were no longer an asset. You were a liability. Someone who could be tortured, interrogated, or worse, talk. The very people who paid you would be the first to put out a second contract on you. And there were no second chances. No, sorry, the blade slipped. I'll try again tomorrow. You had one shot, one moment in time. And if you blew it, the best you could hope for was to die quickly before anyone found out who hired you. Failure also meant shame. The silent, humiliating kind. You didn't just fail to kill. You failed to be invisible, to be perfect. And for assassins, perfection was survival. Anything less might as well paint a target on your back and start practicing your final word speech. It didn't matter how many jobs you'd done before. No one cared that you succeeded 12 times. Because in this profession, you're only as good as your last kill. And if your last kill didn't happen, you'd better start running. So you did it. The plan worked. The dagger struck true. No screams, no guards, just a clean drop to the floor and a very important person who now wasn't. Congratulations. Now run for your life. Because being a successful assassin in medieval times didn't mean sipping wine on a rooftop while the city burned behind you. It meant fleeing through back alleys with someone's blood on your boots and a dog already sniffing your trail. There was no victory lap, no post-job drink with colleagues, no casual debrief with your client. You didn't even get a moment to admire your work. The moment your blade struck, Your new job became escaping everyone who now wants to murder you in increasingly creative ways. Guards coming, doors locked, horses tied up on the other side of town. You're probably bleeding. You had to plan your exit before the kill, routes, disguises, fallback safe houses, maybe a boatman who owed you a favor or at least didn't ask questions, because the city would go on lockdown within minutes. No one wanted a scandal, and lockdown meant closed gates, armed checkpoints, and a dozen angry men with swords who all just received your rough sketch in the phrase, maybe armed and extremely stabby. And let's talk about the client. Assuming they actually planned to pay you, they weren't going to meet you at a cozy tavern with a smile and a thank you card. They'd probably vanish too, because an assassin who just completed a job is the most dangerous person alive. You knew too much. You'd proven you could get into places others couldn't. So even when you succeeded, you walked away with coin in one hand and a giant target on your back. And what did you win? A week of sleeping in hovels, bribing ferry captains, shaving your beard in the dark, and pretending your name was Brother Lucian as you tried to blend in with monks heading east. Because success didn't mean survival. It meant starting the whole game over in a new city, under a new name, with even more people looking for you this time. So yes, you made the kill. Now run like hell. If being a medieval assassin wasn't already miserable enough, poor, hunted, and sleeping in places that smell like goat, you also had to deal with the wonderfully creative paranoia of the people around you. Because in the Middle Ages, assassins weren't just feared, they were considered cursed. To the average peasant, you weren't just a killer in a hood. You were some unholy creature who whispered to demons and smeared frog guts on your blade under a full moon. Why else would you be able to sneak past guards and vanish in the dark? Logic wasn't exactly popular back then. But superstition? Oh, that was everywhere. Some believed assassins could shapeshift. Others claimed you were invisible unless bathed in holy water. One popular tale suggested assassins made pacts with forest spirits and could breathe death through walls. Imagine walking through a village and hearing a woman mutter, "Don't make eye contact. He might hex the baby." Even your tools were suspect. Carrying a dagger? Clearly, it was forged in a cursed forge. Using poison? That wasn't chemistry. That was witchcraft. And you probably stirred it with a severed toe under a blood moon. You'd think this fear might help you. After all, people avoided you, right? But the reality was worse. Superstitious mobs don't hesitate. They don't ask questions. They throw stones, set fires, and shout things like, "Burn him before he calls lightning." Your reputation made people overreact. The second someone died unexpectedly, illness, accident, choking on a chicken bone, someone would whisper, maybe it was a shadow man, maybe it was him. You could be hunted just for existing in the same village as a suspicious death. That meant you had to keep moving. Always stay too long, and suddenly a priest is ringing a bell while 5 angry farmers hold pitchforks like they've been waiting for this moment their entire lives. And heaven help you if you're caught with anything remotely weird, dried herbs, strange coins, or even a foreign accent. That's all it took for someone to shout sorcerer and light a torch. In a world that believed monsters wore human faces, being too quiet, too clever, or too fast made you a threat. And in medieval logic, threats had to die quickly and preferably on fire. Poison, the assassin's weapon of elegance. A quiet kill, no mess, no screaming, no steel on bone, just a sip, a stagger, a sigh, and done. That's the theory. In practice, poisoning someone in the Middle Ages was like trying to win a bar fight with herbal tea and a bad attitude. First off, poisons weren't reliable. You didn't have access to purified cyanide or a neat little pill labeled fast-acting doom. You had plants, mushrooms, minerals, maybe the occasional toad. You had to gather, grind, and pray. And even then, it might just give the target a stomach ache and a renewed commitment to his anti-assassin guard team. There was no scientific measurement. You didn't dose precisely. You eyeballed it. A pinch too little, and the noble just vomits and cancels dinner. A pinch too much, and you die from exposure before the first course is served. Also, medieval kitchens were chaotic. You couldn't just waltz in and season the soup with nightshade. You had to bribe or impersonate a cook, sneak in while no one was watching, or worst of all, try to poison a meal that would go through 3 tasters and a dog. Yes, a dog. And if your victim was a noble, they didn't just eat food. They treated it like a military operation. Meals were tasted, blessed, and sniffed by everyone from the steward to the jester. By the time the food hit their plate, it had passed through more security than a royal wedding. Even assuming you did it, you slipped in the poison, it wasn't detected, and the target actually ate it. The next part was wildly unpredictable. Some poisons took hours, some took days. 1 minute your mark is laughing at a joke. The next, he's clutching his stomach and demanding to see his astrologer. And if they survive, guess who they blame? Not the cook, not the taster. You, the quiet man with the herbal knowledge and twitchy eyes. So poisoning wasn't efficient. It was risky, slow, and full of variables, none of them in your favor. And if you were caught, you didn't get a quick death. You got interrogated with tools until you confessed to poisoning everyone from the Duke to the dog. You'd think that if you successfully changed the course of history by removing a tyrant, sabotaging a royal bloodline, or silencing a political threat, someone would remember your name. Nope, you were an assassin. That meant your name was never meant to be remembered. At best, you were a rumor, some hooded figure, a foreigner with cold eyes, or the quiet man who never finished his ale. You might have pulled off the most legendary hit of the century and still ended up as a mysterious death in the official record. In fact, that was the point. Your client didn't want a story. They wanted plausible deniability. The fewer people who knew who did it, the safer they were, and the less likely they would end up poisoned by their own assassin. So your name was buried the moment the job was done. If you even use a real one, you didn't sign your work. You didn't brag. You didn't keep trophies. You didn't exist outside the moment of the kill. And if someone did know your name, that was a loose end. And in your profession, loose ends had a very short shelf life. And forget about honor. There were no medals for silence. No stone monuments for the man who stopped a war with one dagger in the night. If a noble wanted a statue, they commissioned one for themselves. You got a wooden box, an unmarked grave, or if things went really badly, a head on a spike-labeled traitor. Sometimes your name was known only so it could be cursed. You become a whispered warning. Don't cross the king. Remember what happened to Lord Ulrich? Yes, and the man who did it? Gone like a ghost. That was your legacy, not fame, not fear, just absence. You weren't supposed to leave a mark. You were supposed to vanish. And if you stuck around long enough to be known, that was a fatal mistake. Because in the medieval world, heroes got remembered, assassins got erased. So you survived. You got the job done. You even managed to get paid, a miracle in itself. Now, all you have to do is lay low, keep your head down, and trust that your client will honor the deal and protect your identity, right? Wrong. Because in the world of medieval assassination, there was one rule even more sacred than don't get caught. Never trust anyone, especially the person paying you. Your client, be they a noble, a merchant, or a bishop with ambition and very loose morals, didn't hire you out of respect. They hired you because they needed something awful done, and you were the sharpest tool in the shadows. Once the job was complete, you became a liability. You knew too much. You knew who wanted who dead, when, why, and possibly how much they were willing to pay for it. That made you dangerous, not just to their enemies, but also to them. So what did they do? They ghosted you. They denied they ever met you. Or worse, they sent someone else after you to clean up, to tie off the contract with something sharper than ink. There were even cases where clients double-booked, hiring one assassin to do the job and another to kill the first one immediately after. No refunds, just reduced risk. And if you dared try to blackmail a client, threaten to expose them, that was bold. And also your final mistake. Because powerful people in the Middle Ages didn't negotiate with assassins. They crushed them. If your client had a shred of honor, a rare species indeed, you might get paid and left alone. But even then, you'd still have to assume they were watching you from a distance, with someone already sharpening steel and memorizing your walk. You were the secret that couldn't talk, the shadow that couldn't stay. Even success wasn't enough to earn trust, because in their eyes, if you killed once, you could kill again, and no one, Not even the person who hired you wanted to be next. Let's say somehow you beat the odds. You survived the kills, the lies, the poisonings, the betrayals. You outlived your enemies, your employers, and probably your own sense of morality. Now what? You retire? Absolutely not. Because in medieval times, assassins didn't get retirement plans. There were no farewell banquets, no quiet cottages by the sea, no pensions paid in gold coins and grateful whispers. You didn't fade into a peaceful life. You vanished or you died, often both. The problem was simple: you were never safe. Even if you walked away from the job, your past didn't. You had too many secrets in your head, too many names in your memory, and too much blood on your hands. People didn't want you retired. They wanted you forgotten, which usually meant buried. And even if no one came after you, and that's a big if, you had to live with a constant fear that someone might, that a new assassin, young and eager to prove himself, had just received a contract for a shadowy figure who used to be someone dangerous. So, you changed your name again. You moved to a village where no one asked questions. You faked a limp, sold herbs, pretended you once worked as a guard. But even then, you didn't sleep well. You avoided crowds. You always sat facing the door. You kept your dagger on the floorboard next to the pouch of coins you never touched, because it still smelled like the man you earned it from. And you couldn't trust yourself either. Years of silent killings and quick escapes did something to your brain. Every knock on the door made you flinch. Every stranger on the road might recognize you. You stopped dreaming because dreaming was dangerous. You couldn't love. You couldn't relax. You couldn't laugh too loud. You lived like a ghost pretending to be a man. The truth was, there was no end game for a medieval assassin. Just a slow, cold fade into obscurity. Always moving, always watching, until one day you slipped into the dark and no one noticed. And maybe that was the best you could hope for. By now you probably figured it out. Being a medieval assassin wasn't darkly romantic. It wasn't noble. It wasn't even all that profitable. It was a grim, thankless, short-lived career wrapped in blood-stained linen, and followed by a crowd of people who wanted you dead. You wouldn't last, not a week, maybe not even a day, because you'd start with the wrong assumptions, that you'd be sleek, in control, a whisper in the dark. But what you'd really be is cold, hungry, and one bad guess away from the noose. You'd slip into town, cloak pulled tight, ready for action, only to discover that your target moved locations. The guards are drunk but trigger happy, and the stable boy you paid for information just sold you out for a mug of ale and a piece of bread. You'd freeze at the wrong time, stab the wrong guy, get spotted by someone's maid who once saw your face near the chapel, and suddenly you're not a shadow. You're the problem. Then what? You run, but you're not used to medieval terrain. The mud, the uneven cobblestones, the absolutely insane number of loose chickens in the street. You slip, fall, get tackled by a guard named Thomas who just got dumped and is looking for an outlet. And let's say you survive that. Then you deal with the aftermath. No allies, no honor, and no future. Just whispers, suspicion, and the growing realization that even if you succeed, the best you can hope for is to die old and alone, hiding behind a false name in a village that still believes in fairies. So no, you wouldn't last. And frankly, you shouldn't try, because the assassin's life wasn't cool. It was a cruel machine that chewed people up and spat out nothing but shadows. It offered power without peace and purpose, without a place in the world. You didn't make history. You erased yourself from it. And the only thing waiting for you at the end was silence. A silence no one would question because no one even remembered you were there in the first place. Before she was the feared queen of Macedon, Olympias was known as Myrtale, a Melasian princess from the rugged tribal lands of Epirus. Her people claimed descent from Achilles himself. And whether or not the blood of heroes truly ran in her veins, one thing was certain. This was not a woman born for the sidelines of history. From a young age, Myrtle was steeped in mystery and ritual. Her upbringing was shaped not just by politics, but by prophecy, ecstatic rites, and a reverence for the ancient gods. She wasn't the type of princess who smiled and embroidered tapestries. No, she was drawn to serpents, omens, and the frenzied ceremonies of the cult of Dionysus, where women danced barefoot in the moonlight and called upon the divine in states of trance. Her connection to the gods wasn't performative. It was personal. She didn't merely worship, she embodied. According to ancient sources, likely written by men both terrified and enthralled, she kept sacred snakes in her chambers and even allowed them to coil beside her in bed. Whether this was a literal fact or the kind of slander that powerful women attract like flies, we'll never know. But it stuck. To her allies, it made her divine. To her enemies, it made her dangerous. Her real power began not in a battlefield or a throne room, but in the uneasy flicker of torchlight, among the whispers of priestesses and the curling bodies of serpents. She wasn't just a princess, she was a living oracle, a woman touched by something older than politics and colder than steel. So when Philip II of Macedon, brutal, brilliant, and famously, let's just say prolific, arrived at the island of Samothrace for a religious initiation, he didn't just meet a beautiful princess. He met a mystery he couldn't resist. Their marriage wasn't just a political alliance. It was a collision of prophecy and power. And from the very beginning, it was full of omens. Some said lightning struck the sky on their wedding night. Others claimed Olympias dreamed of a thunderbolt entering her womb. All of it would become legend. But one thing is certain. The union of Olympias and Philip didn't just create a child. It created Alexander the Great, and she intended to shape his destiny from the very first breath. Olympias' marriage to Philip II was not the fairy tale one might expect for a queen who would one day birth an empire. From the beginning, it was a combustible mix of prophecy, pride, and paranoia. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympias wasn't one to sit quietly in the shadows. She held her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to turn oracles and rites to divine her future and perhaps Philip's fate. Macedon wasn't exactly an easy kingdom to walk into. It was a land of ire and ambition, where kings were killed by cousins and brothers turned into rivals overnight. But Olympias, the priestess of Epirus, walked in with her head held high and eyes already on the crown. Their marriage was rocky from the start. Philip, for all his political genius, was not built for monogamy. He would go on to marry multiple women, often for alliances, always for power. But Olympias wasn't one to sit quietly in the shadows. She held her own court, maintained her own alliances, and was known to turn oracles and rites to divine her future and perhaps Philip's fate. Then came the birth of Alexander. Even that was wrapped in celestial drama. Legends say Olympias dreamed that a thunderbolt struck her womb and that flames danced around her child without burning him. Philip reportedly had a vision of sealing his wife's womb with a lion. Yes, a literal lion. Whether they believed these visions or invented them, they certainly acted as if Alexander was destined to rule not just a kingdom but the world. But even as the child was celebrated, cracks in the royal marriage deepened. Olympias resented Philip's other wives, especially his Macedonian bride, Cleopatra Eurydice, whom he married later in life. This was more than a domestic issue. It was a threat. Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and any son she bore would be pure in the eyes of the local nobility, a direct threat to Alexander's future. Olympias saw it clearly. The palace wasn't just a home. It was a battlefield, and she would use every snake, dream, ritual, and whisper she had to make sure her son wasn't just remembered but crowned. She was no longer Meritale. She was Olympias now, and no one would take her son's throne without facing her wrath. By the time Alexander was a teenager, the Macedonian palace in Pella had become a war zone of veiled insults, political maneuvering, and bitter rivalries. Olympias wasn't just fighting for influence. She was fighting for survival. She knew that the court was filled with snakes, but she was the one who taught them how to bite. Philip II had begun to distance himself from her. He was campaigning more, drinking more, and perhaps worst of all, listening more to his Macedonian advisors. The final blow came when he married a young noblewoman named Cleopatra Eurydice, not to be confused with the Cleopatra of Egypt. This Cleopatra was Macedonian-born, and her uncle Attalus was one of Philip's top generals. To Olympias, it wasn't just betrayal. It was a declaration of war. The marriage ceremony was a disaster. At the feast, Attalus drunkenly mocked Olympias and Alexander, calling into question the legitimacy of Alexander's birth. Was he really Philip's son, or was he the child of a god, as Olympias liked to claim? It was meant as an insult, but Olympias sees a myth. Let them whisper, let them believe her son was touched by Zeus. It made him untouchable. Alexander stormed out of the feast. Olympias left Macedon entirely, retreating to Epirus. But her exile was not defeat. It was strategy. In her homeland, she was still royalty. She could gather support, whisper in ears, and watch as Philip's palace began to rot from within. She didn't need to be physically present to be dangerous. Then came the shockwave. Philip was assassinated at his daughter's wedding, just as he was about to invade Persia, just as he was on the verge of crowning himself not just king of Macedon, but potential emperor of the known world. The question that echoed through every marble corridor and torchlit hall was the same. Who did it? Was it Pausanias, the jilted bodyguard who carried out the act? Was it the result of court intrigue? Was it Alexander himself? Or, whisper it softly, was it Olympias? No one could prove it. No one dared. But many believed it. After all, within days Cleopatra Eurydice and her newborn child were dead, murdered, some say, by Olympias herself. The serpent had returned to the palace, and now nothing stood between her son and the throne. With Philip dead and Macedon in mourning or confusion, Olympias made her move. While others scrambled to understand the chaos, she acted swiftly, brutally, decisively. First, Cleopatra Eurydice, the young Macedonian queen and rival wife, was eliminated. According to chilling accounts, Olympias didn't just have her killed. She made her death symbolic, public, humiliating. Some say Cleopatra was forced to hang herself after watching her infant daughter be murdered. Others claim Olympias had the child thrown onto a funeral pyre. What's agreed upon is this: no mercy was shown. Olympias understood what many mothers in ancient courts refused to accept. In a royal palace, mercy is a liability. A rival child, no matter how small, is a future war. And Olympias was done playing defense. With Cleopatra and her bloodline erased, she could turn her attention to securing Alexander's throne. Her teenage son, bold, brilliant, already trained by Aristotle, was declared king without serious opposition. But don't be fooled. It wasn't just his charisma or his father's legacy that made it possible. It was Olympias. She knew which generals to threaten, which nobles to flatter, and which enemies to quietly remove. She wasn't just protecting her son's rise. She was engineering it. Alexander himself didn't always approve. He reportedly disapproved of the violence against Cleopatra's family. But he also didn't stop it, because deep down he knew what Olympias had always known. Power demands blood. And in Macedon, bloodlines were both a blessing and a curse. With her son now king, Olympias began to recede slightly from public life. But this was no retirement. She simply shifted from open strikes to whispered influence. As Alexander prepared to launch his conquest of Persia, she remained behind, not as a passive queen mother, but as the spiritual guardian of his destiny. She sent him sacred relics, consulted oracles, and performed rituals on his behalf. To Olympias, her son's mission wasn't just military, it was divine. Alexander wasn't going to war, he was fulfilling prophecy. And as long as she drew breath, no rival, Macedonian, Persian, or otherwise, would derail that divine plan. She had crowned her son. She had cleansed the palace. Now she would guard his empire from behind the curtain, with teeth bared. When news of Alexander's death in Babylon reached Macedon in 323 BC, it didn't arrive like a trumpet. It arrived like a dagger. For Olympias, it wasn't just the loss of a son. It was the collapse of a world she had spent decades building. Her boy, the divine storm she had prophesied, raised, unleashed, was gone. And he left behind no clear heir, no single successor, only chaos. The mighty empire he carved out was already fracturing. Generals, his so-called successors, were already dividing it up like jackals around a corpse. Antipater still held power in Macedon and Greece, and he had no love for Olympias. Worse, her daughter Cleopatra, Alexander's sister, was being courted by rival generals for marriage. each one hoping to use her bloodline as a claim to the throne. Olympias saw what was coming. Civil war wasn't a possibility, it was inevitable. And once again, she would have to act. But she no longer had Alexander. What she had instead was his bloodline. His young son, Alexander IV, born to Roxanne, the Bactrian princess Alexander had married. Roxanne, still in Macedon, was vulnerable. The boy was even more so. Olympias recognized that the infant was now the last true piece of her son's legacy, and that made him a target, but it also made him a weapon. She allied herself with Roxanne and the boy, determined to protect them and use the child's birthright to stake her own claim in the political battlefield. But the tide was turning. The generals who once bowed to Alexander had no interest in kneeling to his widow or his mother. They had armies now, ambitions, and grudges. Olympias didn't flinch. She'd faced snakes, traitors, and kings. A few warlords with crowns and stolen spears wouldn't scare her. So she plotted. She waited. She watched as Antipater died and was replaced by his son Cassander, a man with ice in his veins and no tolerance for the old queen's games. It was only a matter of time before these two forces collided. The serpent mother of Alexander and the cold-eyed usurper who wanted her buried. Alexander was gone, but his shadow was still moving, and Olympias was still coiled within it, ready to strike. Years after Alexander's death, while his empire crumbled into civil war, Olympias made her most audacious move yet. She returned to Macedon, not as a grieving mother, but as a political force of divine fury. The regency had been splintered. Cassander, the son of her old enemy Antipater, was seizing power, and Roxanne, along with young Alexander IV, was effectively imprisoned. Olympia saw the writing on the wall. If she did not act now, her grandson would vanish like a shadow at dusk. So she made a deal with Polyperchon, an aging general who still held a flicker of legitimate authority. Olympias would return not to plead, but to rule. With Polyperchon's backing, she entered Macedon at the head of an army, and the moment her feet touched home soil, everything changed. Towns opened their gates. Soldiers defected to her side. Even some of her old enemies hesitated. Olympias, despite her age, was still a name that shook the ground. Then came her vengeance. One by one, she hunted down the loyalists of Cassander. And when she finally caught Philip III Aridaeus, Alexander's mentally impaired half-brother and puppet king, she ordered his execution. According to some sources, his wife Eurydice was captured and given the opportunity to kill herself. When she refused, Olympias had her strangled. It was brutality veiled in royal protocol, and Olympias, ever theatrical, staged the scene like a goddess delivering justice. Her message was clear. Only the bloodline of Alexander had the right to rule. Everyone else was a pretender. For a brief, burning moment, Olympias held the kingdom in her grip. She had restored the dynasty. She had avenged betrayals. She had reminded Macedon what royal power looked like when wielded by a woman with nothing left to lose. But power in Macedon was like fire in dry grass. And Cassander was still out there, calculating, biding his time. He returned with a vengeance. His army outnumbered hers. His resources deeper, his cruelty colder. Her allies began to abandon her. Polyperchon lost influence. The tide turned. Olympias, now isolated in the fortress of Pydna, watched as her enemies closed in. She had lit the match. Macedon had burned, and now the smoke was thick, and her enemies were at the gates. Olympias, once the most feared woman in the ancient world, now found herself besieged in the coastal fortress of Pydna, alone, cut off, surrounded by the army of Cassander, who had come to finish what his father had started. But Olympias didn't beg. She didn't plead. For nearly a year, she endured the siege like a statue carved from divine wrath. Food ran short. Disease crept in. Allies vanished. Yet within the fortress walls, she maintained the same unshakable presence that had once shaken kings. To the very end, she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as the mother of a god. Cassander, ever cautious, hesitated. He knew killing Olympias was dangerous. Even now, she carried a myth around her like armor. She was still the mother of Alexander the Great. To strike her down might seem like blasphemy, so he offered her safety. Surrender, he said, and her life would be spared. Olympias knew better. She had seen too many royal promises turn to ash. Still, hunger was no longer just a discomfort. It was death. Her garrison broke. Her followers surrendered. And Olympias, unbending until the very end, was finally handed over to her enemies. Cassander didn't kill her himself. That would have been too simple and too merciful. Instead, he turned her over to the families of those she had executed during her brief return to power. Let them decide her fate. They condemned her to death. But here's the catch. When the executioners came, no one dared strike the first blow. Olympias stood tall, regal, silent, eyes fixed on him like an oracle staring through smoke. These were Macedonians. They had grown up hearing of her rituals, her visions, her snakes. They had once cheered her son as a living god. And now here she stood, a frail old woman cloaked in myth. And not a single man had the courage to swing the sword. So Cassander sent others, foreigners, outsiders, people who had no memory of her power, only orders to follow. And thus Olympias was finally struck down, not with ceremony, not with dignity, but with silence. Her death marked the end of Alexander's bloodline in any meaningful power. And with it, the final ember of an empire founded on divine ambition was snuffed out. But even in death, Olympias left behind a shadow. And history would never forget the Serpent Queen. Olympias died not on a throne but in the dust, unarmed, abandoned, and executed by the very people she once ruled. But history is strange. It does not always favor the ones who die in silk sheets. Sometimes it remembers those who went down hissing. And Olympias was never meant for a quiet history. In life, she had wielded motherhood like a sword and prophecy, like a shield. She wasn't just the mother of Alexander the Great. She was one of the architects of his rise. Without her, there is no myth of the divine child, no rituals whispering of thunderbolts and lions, no ruthless purging of rivals that cleared the path for a teenage king to rule the known world. Olympias didn't just give birth to an empire, she defended it with claws. Yet even among the ancient world's most ruthless dynasts, Olympias stands apart. She didn't command armies in the field like Cleopatra or ride into battle like Boudica. Her battlefield was subtler and colder. It was a world of poisoned goblets, political marriages, priestesses, and oracles. She understood the power of fear, and even more importantly, she understood the power of belief. She made people believe her son was divine, and she may have believed it herself. Her enemies branded her a murderer, a witch, a manipulator, and they weren't wrong. Olympias was all those things and more. She was a product of a brutal world that respected cunning far more than kindness. And she learned early that mercy was a luxury queens couldn't afford. In the centuries that followed, she was both vilified and mythologized. Some called her a villain, others a visionary, but no historian, ancient or modern, could call her irrelevant. She haunted the legacy of Alexander like a phantom, always in the background, always just behind the curtain. And maybe that's exactly where she belonged, not as a tragic mother or a footnote in a king's story, but as a story unto herself, the woman who wrapped herself in prophecy, slept beside snakes, and outlived gods. Olympias's bones turned to dust long ago, but her legend endures in every tale of ruthless queens, in every whisper of blood-borne destiny, in every empire built on myth. She is still there, coiled in the dark, waiting. On the sun-bleached island of Crete, just a few miles south of the modern city of Heraklion, lies a ruin that feels more like a dream than a real place. Stone corridors snake in all directions. Rooms twist and double back. Staircases lead nowhere. It's easy to lose your sense of direction even today. This place is Knossos, the heart of Minoan civilization and the supposed inspiration for one of the most enduring myths in human history, the Labyrinth of the Minotaur. But before there was a legend, there was a palace unlike any other. Built around 1900 BCE and expanded over centuries, Knossos wasn't just a royal residence. It was an entire city under one roof, covering nearly 150,000 square feet. It featured over 1,000 rooms, light wells, storage magazines, shrines, workshops, and what may have been the first flushing toilets in history. It had running water, multi-story apartments, and an intricate system of air circulation. This wasn't a primitive fortress. It was an architectural masterpiece. To modern archaeologists, Knossos looks like organized chaos. To ancient visitors, it probably felt like magic. The man who brought Knossos into modern awareness was British archaeologist Arthur Evans. In the early 1900s, Evans, what an incredible journey through history, right? From the back alleys with rusty daggers to the royal courts filled with serpents and prophecies. These stories are far wilder than fiction. If you are hooked by these tales and want to uncover more hidden historical gems, make sure to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps me bring these fascinating, often hilarious, and sometimes terrifying historical truths to life. What's one historical myth you'd love to see busted next? Let me know in the comments.